Hola amigos, welcome back to 90 Days of Spanish. This is day 3, the series where you're learning Spanish for 90 days with me to see how much progress you can make, how much can you learn and improve in 90 days. If you're new here, my name is Edward. I've been teaching languages for over 10 years. When I first started, I could only speak my native language, Spanish. Now I speak 4 languages, Spanish, English, Chinese and Polish. And so on this channel, I like to share with you all the lessons I learned along the way so you can do it too. Let's get started with day number 3. As usual, we have 2 main things to go over. First is going to be a learning technique that you can use to improve your Spanish, whatever level you might be at. These techniques are useful for beginners, intermediate, advanced, it doesn't matter. And the main topic of the day, where you actually learn some useful day-to-day conversation Spanish. Let's get started with the first section of the video. Let's go ahead with learning techniques. Today's learning technique is reading an article per day. Now, sounds very simple, sounds very obvious, but I think the most important thing about reading an article every day, like with any other learning technique, is about doing it right. And how do we do it right? How do you make sure that what you're doing is actually yielding the best results, is actually going to give you the most benefit for the time you spend doing it? Because if there is something that we're doing that takes up a lot of time, but it's just kind of busy work, it doesn't necessarily translate to improvement in your language, well then it's not really worth it. It's not very efficient, is it? So how do we use reading, specifically reading articles, to improve your Spanish fast and to help you actually make improvements? The first thing you need to keep in mind when doing this exercise is you can't stick to articles of only topics that you're familiar with. And more often than not, the way that ends up happening is because you're choosing topics that you already like. And because you already like them, you know about them. And you will already know a lot about it. That's how that ends up happening. Say you're into sports, you like sports, I don't know, specifically, let's talk about Formula 1. Let's say you like Formula 1, so you read articles about it. You read a lot about it in English, and you start trying to learn Spanish. You start trying to read in Spanish, so you start reading a bit about it in Spanish. Great. Now the problem is, unlike in your native language where you can read only those articles, but you already speak the whole of the language, so you know other words of other topics, would you need to talk about other things? With Spanish, because you're acquiring this language, this is your second language, you don't know other words. So if you only stick to reading those articles of specifically Formula 1, when you need in conversation to talk about something else, you just don't have the words. The vocab's not there, right? You need to be consuming as much variety as possible. You need to be reading as much variety as possible. Students ask me, how do I improve my vocabulary? When I try to speak, I'm always looking for the words. Well, maybe because there is not enough in there, right? Like, imagine it like this. Imagine that your brain is a library. And every time you recall a word, you request a word out of your brain, you're like, give me one. And your brain needs to go through all the books and things you've read and find one. Of course, you're not going to remember every single word, but how more likely is it that you will have something to say, you will find some word you can use if you have a lot more different versions of things you've read rather than just a very narrow sample of things you've read. If you only have a few things you've read, there is only a few sample of vocabulary you can draw from. So if you forget any of it, well, you've forgotten most of it. If you only know 10 words and you forget 2 words doesn't sound like a lot to lose. But if you only know 10, you've lost 20% of your vocabulary, right? You don't have access to that anymore. And like, I'm not talking about like you've permanently forgot just in the moment, but in the moment, you don't have access to 20% of your vocabulary. So if you've learned 100 words, now losing 2 is not a big deal. You see what I mean? So that's why you need more input before you start demanding of yourself more output. Right? Now, once you do that, once you've chosen the topic and once you're making sure that every day you're choosing a different topic, even if it's a topic you don't particularly enjoy or like, once you're doing that, then how do we go about reading it? How do we turn it into the most purposeful use of your time, into the best use of your time to read this article? There is something called, in learning, in education, there is something called active learning and passive learning, right? Active learning is when we're doing things, exercises that force us to think and process the information that it's coming in. Passive learning is when you're not putting the conscious effort into what you're doing. You're just passively consuming. So, for example, if you're learning Spanish and you sit down to watch a TV show and you watch a 20-minute TV show and you're just sitting there watching and listening, this is called passive learning. Of course, you're learning, you are acquiring, but it is in a passive mode, right? You're not going out of your way to consciously make an effort to acquire every single word that is, being presented to you in this TV show. So that's why it's passive learning. It is very important and it is very useful to have passive learning as part of your routine. Many times we don't have enough passive learning and that could be a problem. But in this particular case, I'm talking about reading, we actually need to do the opposite, because reading tends to very easily fall into passive learning when it comes to language learning. Of course, if you're reading and you're learning about a subject, you are learning the subject itself. But if you're just reading, sometimes the words go in one ear and out the other one. And if you're doing it in your second language and you're doing it in your target language in Spanish, when it's even more likely that they're just going to go straight through and they're not going to stick. So that's why we need to make sure that we're using active learning when we read an article. How do we turn the act of reading into an active learning exercise? Well, you pick your article. Ideally, it's in print. Ideally, it's in a physical format. If you can't and you prefer to do it digitally, that's okay. You can work with that as well. I've seen maybe on the phone is not ideal, but on the computer is all right, or on your tablet is even better because you can highlight. What you're going to want to be doing is you're going to be reading and you're going to be highlighting. We're going to read a couple of times. We're not going to read this article just the one time. We're going to read it 3 times. The first time, we're looking for words we don't recognize, words we don't understand, entirely new words, right? We're reading along and looking for words that we don't know. We highlight these words that we don't know. We circle them. Once we've done that, we go ahead and on our notes section, wherever if this is in print in your notebook, if it's in digital format, wherever you're keeping notes, you write down the list of the words. But you don't just make a list of 20 words you don't know in one go. No. You write word number 1. You go and look up what it means. And you try, if you need to translate it, that's okay. If your Spanish is good enough to look up the definition in Spanish, even better. But if you're not there yet, it's okay that you just look up the translation. But when you write down on your notes, don't just write the translation. Ideally, don't even write the translation. This is called a Spanish-only book method, which is something I will talk about more in the future. But try to avoid as much as you can having English in your Spanish notebook. How do we do that? Well, try to use your own Spanish, your own words in Spanish, in as simple Spanish as you can, to describe the meaning of the word you just found. So, in Spanish, to learn the Spanish new word, the new Spanish word. Does that make sense? It doesn't have to be super accurate. You're not trying to publish a dictionary. It's okay if it's a little bit off. The main thing is that you remember it. The main thing is that you get it. That you can actually look back at it and be like, oh yeah, I remember what it means. Then, write an example of your own using that word. Not the one that's on the paragraph of the text that you're reading, of the article that you're reading. No. One of your own. A completely separate, new, in a different context, so that you can learn this word and your brain can go, okay, so I'm processing this word. I'm acquiring this word. Acquisition is an important, it's an extremely important part of language learning. When we learn a language, we need to acquire this language. It's not just about knowing of it. It's about acquiring it, becoming a part of your brain, engraved into your memory, so that you can use it later on. And that only happens if we do these kinds of exercises. So, like I said, ideally don't write the meaning in English, just write it in Spanish, in simple Spanish, but write it in Spanish. Then write your example. Beautiful, we've written our example, good. And you do that for each one of the words. Is this going to take a while? Yes, it's going to take a while. But it's active learning. It's meant to take a bit of a while, okay? Once you do that, then you go and read the article again. This time, you're going to read the article and highlight or circle or however you want phrases that you don't understand. So, the first time we were just going for a very surface level, vocab-based problem. What words do I not know? We've already taken care of that. At this point, you should know all the words on the text. You should know all the words, but now maybe some of the meaning, some of the message, it's still not clear to you. So you're going to highlight phrases, sentences that you don't understand. Then you're going to go and look those up. Look them up. Find out. Ask me here. Leave comments on my videos and ask me, hey, Profe, I was reading this article the other day and I came across this phrase and I'm not entirely sure what it means, even though I know all the words because I've already done that bit, but I still don't understand what the phrase means. Can you help me out? Okay? And I'll be happy to do that for you. So do that. And then, once again, try to rewrite the same phrase, the same sentence, but in simpler words, in your own words, so that you can understand it, so that you can process what it really means. When you're done with that, and you've done all of that for the whole text, and this is why it's important to try to choose not super long articles, because otherwise we'll be at this all day, and who has all day? Sadly, we can't just sit around learning languages all day, though I wish we could do that, but we can't. We all have responsibilities, jobs, and things to get to, so we can't do that all day. So for that reason, yeah, choose a shorter paragraph, a shorter article, okay? Don't go crazy on the length of it, because otherwise it'll take you too long. Or if it's a very long one, but you want to read it, then read it in sections, right? On the first day, you can read the first half. And then the second day, you do the other half. Or if it's even longer, then do it in 3 days, 4 days. Adapt, you'll see. Depends on how much time you have to dedicate to it, right? Once you've done that, but it's important, if you divide it by section, it's important that you divide it by sections, but you complete the 3 steps reading of each section in one sitting. Don't do all the words today and then the phrases tomorrow. That one's not great. That one doesn't work so well, because then your brain is gonna have this like blurry image of, okay, I kind of read something, but like, did I understand? Not really. And it's probably not going to remember as well. We need to get through all 3 steps in one sitting. So if you can't do the whole article in one sitting, then just do less of it, but do all 3 steps in one sitting. That is very important. Don't skip on that. Okay. After step 2, step 3, now we read it again. And now we're just reading. Ideally, you read it out loud, so you can also make sure that you're getting your pronunciation practice in there. But read it. Now you have your words, you have your phrases, you've looked them up, you've written examples, you've written definitions, you've written with your own words, with your own Spanish, what it all means. It's taken you a while. It's probably taken you a while to do that, to get to that point. So now you're going to just sit and read the whole thing in one go, trying to understand the entire thing, the whole message. You finish reading it, and then you sit with it for a while. You sit with it for a few minutes, pondering, thinking of what you just read, of what you just understood, of all the new words you've now acquired, of all the new phrases you've learned, and what it all means. And that's how you turn reading, which tends to be a passive learning method, into a very active learning method, a very proactive learning method. Okay? So that's that. That's the difference. That's what makes the major difference between, oh, teacher, I'm reading, but I'm not improving. Okay, but are you active reading or are you only passive reading? Both are great. Both are important. We need to do both. But are you doing active reading as well? Or is it just passive reading? Because then maybe that's the hurdle. Maybe that's the holdup. Maybe that's why you're not making progress. So try that. Okay? All right. Now, the main topic of today. The main topic of today is daily routine. How to talk about a daily routine. We're going to split it in 3. We're going to split it into morning, afternoon, and evening. En la mañana, in the morning. En la tarde, in the afternoon. En la noche, in the evening. So that's the first thing you're going to know. You're going to want to know how to separate the day into these big chunks. En la mañana, en la tarde, en la noche. It's easier to talk about it when we break it up like that. So let's start with that. En la mañana, in the morning. Let's say 3 things that we do en la mañana, in the morning. I'll tell you what 3 things I do. En la mañana, normalmente, me despierto a las 8:30 de la mañana. Desayuno un café con pan y natilla. O pan con huevos y tocino. Tomo una ducha y me alisto para trabajar. So, we've talked about 3 things that I do in the mornings, en la mañana. Normalmente, that was the first thing I said. Very useful word for you. You normally. The translation is normally, but I guess you could say it's more like usually. That's how we use it. We use it to mean usually. Okay? And now, what are the 3 things? I'm not going to tell you. That's your homework. Go ahead and tell me in the comments, what are the 3 things that I said? And what are the 3 things that you normalmente like to do in your morning? Okay? Now, en la tarde, in the afternoon. Let's talk about my afternoon routine. Generalmente, another word for usually. Generalmente, almuerzo y veo videos en YouTube. Trabajo dando clases de español o trabajo en la cafetería. A veces llamo a mi familia. Okay, so that was in the afternoon. Generalmente, very useful word. Usually, again, it's another word. So we have normalmente, generalmente. And there are the 3 things that I usually, generalmente, do in my afternoons. So now, you tell me, what do you usually do in your afternoon routine? Y por último, and finally, en la noche. En la noche, at night, or in the evening. Usualmente, now this is a mirror word with usually. Usualmente. Usualmente, regreso a mi casa y grabo un video para mis estudiantes. Veo una película y preparo mi cena. Hablo con mi novia sobre nuestro día. All right, so there you have it. That is my evening routine. En la noche. Usualmente. That's the useful word of this one. Usualmente. Go ahead and tell me, what is your evening routine? What do you usually do in your evenings? In Spanish. Unless you can't, then I'll allow it in a bit of English or a bit of Spanglish, and I'll help you with the translation. I'll help you with the new words that you might not know. But try your best. Do your best to do it in Spanish, okay? So that was the main topic of today, and that is 90 Days of Spanish, day number 3, all done for us. Watch another video. Subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss any future videos. And thank you very much for watching. Nos vemos la próxima.